What do you like? Tell me what you like.
I love the idea of nourishing both our body and our soul.
Welcome to the Nourishing You Podcast presented by the National Association of Nutrition Professionals, NANP. We invite you to join Kristen Burkett and Diana Wally as they host experts from the holistic wellness space who will share practical tips and information to enhance your health and vitality. Kristen and Diana are master nutrition therapists and board certified in holistic nutrition, with private practices that support their clients as they strive to reach their full potential. If you enjoy today's show, please help us out by commenting below, liking this video, and subscribing to the channel to help us spread the word.
You have to move your body. That's my message. That's my passion.
This episode of the Nourishing You Podcast is brought to you by Practice Better.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Nourishing You Podcast. Today, we're going deep into a topic in our 3-part mini-series focused on gut health. It's one that affects so many people, but is still so often misunderstood, and that's small intestine bacterial overgrowth, also known as SIBO. It's my personal pleasure to have a renowned expert in this area, Dr. Allison Siebecker, here with us to shed some light. Dr. Allison Siebecker is the 2021 Lifetime Achievement Award recipient from the Gastro ANP, co-founder and former medical director of the SIBO Center for Digestive Health at the National University of Natural Medicine, clinician, researcher, patient advocate, and educator. Faculty positions include NUNM, where she teaches advanced gastroenterology, and the GI Health Foundation's IBS board. She's the co-founder of the NUNM SIBO Symposium, NUNM GI Conference, and SIBO SOS Summits, and the author of the free educational website, SIBOinfo.com. Dr. Siebecker's integrative SIBO protocols are used internationally and reflect the most up-to-date core protocols for SIBO and EMO. Welcome, Dr. Siebecker. Your training and generous resources have been just instrumental in my understanding and approach to working with clients over the years, and it's just personally rewarding to be able to talk with you today. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Kristen said, that it's such an honor to have you with us. And not just because you're widely considered one of the early leaders in SIBO education and treatment, so a true OG, but you're also an excellent health communicator, I think, which is why you've remained relevant for so long. And you're also a delightful person. So we're really, really looking forward to this. Before we get started unpacking gut health, can you tell us a little more about yourself, your background, and why you specialize in this area?
Yeah, my story, I know, is like so many people who they specialize in something that they suffered from. So I have had a lot of digestive troubles my whole life. They started when I was 5 years old. And gosh, there was like nobody who knew what it was. There was no diagnosis. And it was so frustrating. And I was always interested in health, but then I eventually went to medical school, probably in part because my mom had health troubles and if there was only something I could do to help people who were suffering, And even at medical school or naturopathic medical school, there was no answers. But so then it was not until after I graduated, I found out about the term SIBO and the concept of SIBO from like 2 different areas, kind of the alternative world and then the medical world. And so that was one of my first things I wanted to do, was bring them together as one and educate. Because when I first applied the treatments and I started with diet on myself, I got such incredible relief just in like 24 hours. And to think of all the years I'd been suffering, and then to think of all the people who are suffering, so that's like what made me have such a passion to want to share information, and why I have like a free website, and why I'm so happy to be here to talk, because anything we can do, it's needless suffering. There's answers for it. So anything we can do to help.
Oh, just love that. So I want to say, just for our audience, if you or someone you know has struggled with symptoms like bloating, gas, abdominal discomfort, or what's often labeled as IBS, there's a good chance that SIBO may have come up in that conversation, or it should have. So Dr. Siebecker, to get us started, can you help us understand what SIBO actually is? What does small intestinal bacterial overgrowth mean in practical terms? And what's that connection to IBS?
Yeah, that's so important. It's let's start with that. It's known to be one of the main underlying causes of IBS. The majority cause of IBS, up to 70% of IBS, is actually SIBO. And what is it? Well, our definition has expanded and changed, but it's basically when there are normal bacteria that normally live in the intestines that have certain ones have gotten to be too prevalent in the small intestine and or large intestine. That's where our definition has changed. But I think many people are aware of the concept of like large intestine microbiome disruption or dysbiosis. And this isn't a general thing. It's quite specific. It's exact specific bacteria that are known to be overgrown. And when they overgrow, particularly in the small intestine, they interfere with the process of our digestion and absorption of our nutrients. And that really wreaks havoc with a lot of symptoms. And these bacteria that are overgrown, the key thing they do is they make gas. It's like, they eat our food. And just like when we eat, there's the possibility of us having flatulence, of making gas, but they always make gas. So in essence, they're having flatulence inside of our intestines, and then that gas creates symptoms in very many different ways, not just flatulence. And so the symptoms of SIBO, which are the same as IBS, are bloating, abdominal pain or discomfort, constipation, diarrhea, or a mixture of both of those. There could be nausea, there could be acid reflux, there could be burping and farting, there could be a sensation of food not moving down, and there can also be like mental or mood changes, particularly anxiety. SIBO can cause that. It's not uncommon at all. Could cause depression, but anxiety is more common. And probably the number one symptom that most people would identify, other than bloating, is food sensitivities. You get these gastrointestinal digestive symptoms and sometimes extraintestinal, like anxiety, after eating. And so it's just a terrible disorder in that food, which is delicious and we need, causes symptoms.
Yeah. So why do we not want bacteria in the small intestine? Why is that different than the rest of the colon?
Yeah, because they're not meant to have, the small intestine is not meant to have many bacteria. It's designed in that way so that they don't interfere with our process of digestion and absorption of our food. But even still, if they're overgrown in the large intestine, that's not good either. Just with the word over, we know that it's not normal, right? So it's like there's supposed to be a certain amount of bacteria in both of the locations in the intestine. And if we get too many, it's too many and it's going to cause a problem. But in particular, they can really steal our nutrients. They eat our food instead of us getting it. And so SIBO is a malabsorption condition and can cause nutrient deficiencies. It can cause weight loss as well. Some people do not suffer from weight loss who have it, and some people are overweight who have it. But I can say in the patients that I've seen, I saw more people that were unintentionally losing weight. There are many reasons for that, but it is a malabsorption condition. So it just shouldn't, it's interfering with, with that process. And also they damage, the overgrown bacteria can damage the intestinal lining, so we can't absorb our food very well, and can cause leaky gut as well. And that, paired with other components, can lead to other conditions like autoimmune conditions and things like that. So it's unhealthy. We don't want that.
So I have a question about something that could be confusing to the average non-doctor listening. So we hear a lot about the microbiome and how healthy it is to have bacteria in the gut and all of this. But then there's SIBO when the bacteria isn't a good thing. So how do we differentiate between good bacteria, bad bacteria? Is that what it is? Is it simply an overgrowth of good guys? Can you explain that a little bit more? Because I feel like that's something that can confuse people.
I mean, that is such a fascinating question to me. And I've been wondering about that too. And to know about the large intestine microbiome is a little easier because all of the work that's been done on like sequencing the intestinal microbiome has mostly all been done on the large intestine. And so we have a little bit of a better sense of what should and shouldn't be in the large intestine. And there are many stool tests, that seem to be using that information we can do. But for the small intestine, that work really hasn't been done. Most people don't know that all of that sequencing was large intestine. However, one of our main leaders in SIBO, actually, Dr. Pimentel, he and his team have been working on this many-year research project where they are trying to sequence and identify what the small intestine bacteria should be. And through that work, we actually know which are the bacteria that are overgrown in SIBO. We used to think it was just generally, normal bacteria overgrown, like just too many in the wrong location. But that knowledge has changed, and we figured out that, or that understanding, I guess we could say, has changed. And we figured out it's just specific bacteria. So for instance, and we haven't gotten into this yet, but there's 3 main types of SIBO based on the 3 main gases that the microbes make: hydrogen, methane, and hydrogen sulfide. And that goes along with sort of like IBS types and bowel movement pattern types. And it also goes with specific bacteria. So for the hydrogen type, we know it's mostly E. coli that's overgrown, not the pathogenic E. coli, a non-pathogenic one, and Klebsiella. For the methane type, we know it's M. smithii, a big long name, M. smithii, we'll shorten it to. And then for the hydrogen sulfide type, it's different bacteria, whether it's in the small or large intestine. So we know it's Fusobacterium varium in the small intestine, and in the large intestine, it's Desulfovibrio. And there are a few more, actually, but just to give you the sense. So, we can narrow this down to 1 or 2 per gas type and per location. That's a new knowledge. So, and having this knowledge is really helpful because when you know what's causing something, then you know how to target it. Before, if it was just like, oh, there's just too many generally, then that means we can be more specific with agents we're going to use to try to decrease that particular bacteria.
That's a great explanation. And you alluded to kind of with this new expanded understanding that maybe there's different types of, well, maybe you just explained all the types of SIBO, but there's also different variations that kind of present similar to SIBO. Is that accurate? Because you mentioned EMO in your bio. So can you go into like maybe some of the other?
Yeah, well, it's a little confusing because now basically we have new names for, like before we used to just say, well, there's 3 types of SIBO. And I still say that because it's what I'm used to. but now the methane type of SIBO has a new name, and it's called intestinal methanogen overgrowth, or EMO for short, IMO. And that's because the name changed because we know now that can overgrow in the large intestine as well as its own condition, small or large intestine. And also methanogens, or M. smithii, this bacteria, it's not actually a bacteria. It's an archaea, which is a similar microorganism. And so like technically, being real about it, it's not bacterial overgrowth. So they called it intestinal overgrowth to just sort of get around that. And then same for the hydrogen sulfide type, that is now called intestinal sulfide overproduction, or ISO or ESO. And similarly, it's not just in the small intestine, it can overgrow in the large intestine. So like the SI for small intestine in SIBO wasn't technically correct anymore. So we got these new names. But as I speak with people and talk about it, it's just cumbersome to say SIBO, EMO, ESO, like every time. So I just say SIBO, but it's so, and they're not really, like one could say they are separate diseases or conditions. They do all now have their own ICD-10 codes, international diagnostic codes, but they really are sort of coexisting conditions in that they come together all the time. Like it's, you can see people that just have one gas that is positive, but it's so common to see people with 2 or even 3 of the gases positive, meaning they just have this overgrowth all mixed together. So it's not quite right to think of them as separate conditions. And also, I mean, it is, but it isn't. And also for patients, this name change has been confusing because they're like, I thought I just had SIBO. Now I also have emo. It's like, it's not really like you have another disease on top of, it's the same thing, really. We just have new terminology.
And then does fungal overgrowth play a part in this ever, or?
Yeah, fungal overgrowth is also so common in whether it's in the small or large intestine. And, the old name for that is candida, candida overgrowth. We also say yeast overgrowth and fungal. So we have like 3 names for the same thing. And so now people are starting to call it IFO, intestinal fungal overgrowth, right? But it could be small or large. And this is a separate condition. That truly is. Yeast is a different organism, responds to different types of treatment. But the thing is, it can come along with SIBO. And that's pretty common for people to have both. Not everybody does. You could have one or the other or both together.
Thank goodness we have an expert. Okay. Another thing we'd love to talk about is when somebody suspects they might have SIBO. So they've listened to you talk about the different symptoms, conditions, that sort of thing. So now we're at the point where a listener may say, I suspect I might have this. So a couple of questions around that. So where would they go for a diagnosis? Could they go to their conventional gastroenterologist or conventional doctor? Should they see a naturopath, somebody like you? So where should they go? And then how is SIBO collectively diagnosed?
Okay, so it can't, technically, it really can't be diagnosed by symptoms. So that's important to know. We do need a test, and we'll go over that. But the reason I just want to explain why we can't diagnose it by symptoms is we can use the example of the SIFO, or the intestinal yeast overgrowth. They're the exact same symptoms. And not just that, but there's about 30 other conditions that really have the same symptoms as SIBO or yeast overgrowth. The symptoms are non-specific. Those symptoms I mentioned, constipation or diarrhea, bloating, pain, most people will have 2 of them. Gosh, it could be so many things. And that's why we can't just go by symptoms, because that means it could be 30 things. So we have to get a test to figure that out. Now, as to who you go to, the test is not available, like in the US, it's not available from LabCorp or Quest. It's from specialty labs, and it's I don't mean that I just mean from various special labs, and it's a breath test that we need to test for SIBO. And so one would hope that both a primary care physician and naturopaths, alternative medicine practitioners, and gastroenterologists would all know about this and could test you for it. But it's still new enough that not everybody does. And I mean, what I would do is you could go 2 ways. You could either go to your normal practitioner that you're used to going to and ask and find out, or, call the office and find out. So you could do that, or because maybe they do know and they're ready to go. Or what you can do is you can order your own test online directly yourself as a patient. There are several labs that they have. So let me just say this one thing. This test, there's nothing dangerous or anything like that about it, but it uses a sugar substrate, basically a sweetener, as part of it. And one of them, unfortunately, is on like the prescription formulary. It really shouldn't be. There's no need for that, but it just happens to be a holdover, and that's lactulose. It's a lab-created sugar. And that's how we mostly do this test. And so that needs a prescription. And so that can be a little hard to come by. But there are various labs like Direct Labs, True Health Labs, Rupa Labs, places like that, and also TrioSmart, where you can get a SIBO breath test directly as a patient, because they usually contract with an organization of doctors who will write that prescription for the lactulose. So that's another way you can go. And I have various labs listed on my website, SIBO Info, free educational website, where you can find how to order it yourself. It would definitely be best if your practitioner could do it, because hopefully they're also trained in interpretation. Interpretation is a little tricky, but let me just describe the test for a moment a bit more. So it's a breath test, and what we do is there's a prep diet the day before where you reduce the amount of carbohydrates you're eating. That's usually the hardest part. It's not pleasant. Nobody wants to really do that. So because carbohydrates is a massive category of foods. It's all plant food, grains and, vegetables and fruits and things like that. And we're doing that to get a clear reaction to the sugar substrate, which is a carbohydrate. And then the next morning, usually do the test in the morning after an overnight fast. and it takes about 3 hours. So it's simple. It's just not pleasant to do the prep diet. And so you can do it at home with a test kit, and then you mail it in and get your results back in a week or so. And what you do is there's like a tube or a bag, and you're just breathing into that. And how that works is that the gases that the bacteria make in the intestine, they diffuse across into the bloodstream, into the intestinal lining, into the bloodstream, and those gases are then moved to the lungs through the blood, and then we expire them out, and that's what we're testing. So that's basically how we do it. And you start with a sugar solution, and I highly recommend lactulose. There's a debate about what substrate or sugar solution is best in the test, but I recommend a lactulose. And let me just say, lactulose is not the same as lactose. It's confusing. They sound so similar, but it's lactulose that we're using. I think that's probably our best test. The next best would be to use fructose, and the third best would be to use glucose. So I really don't usually recommend a glucose SIBO breath test. And I wanted to mention that because that's the one that's the most readily available for patients to just order themselves. And it can be confusing. You just go onto a site, I can order this one. But I think it's a bit of a waste of money. And the reason why is because the glucose test is really only testing, I'd say maybe the top 3 feet of the small intestine. And it's not testing the vast majority of the small intestine. Small intestine's like 18 feet long, nor is it testing the large intestine. And we know that 2 of the 3 types of SIBO there can be overgrowth in the large intestine. So that's why we need the lactulose, because that glucose sugar is actually just absorbed into the body really quickly, and it's not available to be fermented by the bacteria.
Wow.
Just an anecdote. Years ago, I never would hear of a conventional physician or GI doctor even really knowing what SIBO was. But a couple of years ago, one of my daughters in college, of course, I suspected that she had maybe SIBO, but I'm mom, so what do I know? So we went to the GI doctor, and a conventional doctor, a PA. She was fabulous. And within about 2 minutes after listening to my daughter, she said, so I'm suspecting SIBO. I think we should test for it. And then she and I were best friends. I was like, you know what that is? And we still keep in touch. So those practitioners are out there. And I think it's becoming more, you would know better than me, but it seems to be becoming more and more recognized in conventional medicine.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, you're totally right. Long ago, it used to be a hard sell. When anything's new, there's resistance, and it's not the worst thing. You want to make sure it pans out and it's valid. But the scientific evidence is overwhelming at this point. The problem is not everybody might have seen all the new evidence, and they're just not up to speed that, it's pretty undeniable, and this is what you need to do. So more and more, though, as you say, are knowledgeable on it, and that's so helpful.
Yeah. You must feel so vindicated having been talking about this since, I don't know, 1950. I'm just kidding. A long time.
I'm so, because the thing is, it's needless suffering. It's like, why? I get the resistance to things, but this helps people. Let's help them. Why are you resisting? Let's get this going.
Practice Better is the leading practice management platform built for holistic and integrative health practitioners. Trusted by over 50,000 nutrition professionals, dietitians, health coaches, and wellness providers worldwide, Practice Better brings scheduling, charting, billing, telehealth, and client engagement into one seamless platform. Practitioners can document client nutrition and wellness journeys with customizable templates, run group programs, and deliver personalized care through a built-in client portal, all while staying HIPAA compliant. Practice Better helps wellness professionals build thriving, client-centered practices.
Right. One thing I see quite often anymore with my client base, because I do a lot of digestive work, I have more and more clients that come to me with a SIBO test result from a conventional physician. And maybe they've done a little bit of treatment with them. Sometimes it's been effective, but then sometimes it's not. And so I'm curious what your take is on maybe some differences in the approach to treatment, even though we've got more testing out there available conventionally. What might there be in terms of a different way of addressing the issue once it's found in a test as to why something might be successful or not, or maybe just explain the approach in general.
Oh my gosh, this is a complex and fascinating question. So you'll have to stop me. I could go on and on. Basically, the main methods we have are all equally and very effective. And just briefly, there's pharmaceutical antibiotics, herbal antibiotics, and elemental diet. And we can get into all that in a minute. But one thing that might be happening is the doctor may not know sort of like the standard treatments or the best studied and the treatments we really use for SIBO. So for instance, in pharmaceutical antibiotics, we typically base most of our treatments around using rifaximin, which is in the US, it's known as Xifaxan, that's the brand. But that can be not covered by insurance and expensive. And because of that, many doctors may not even start with that. They might not even try. And so then they may use other antibiotics that were used more than 20 years ago for this condition that aren't as effective. It's like, well, let me just start with whatever, I don't know. I can't even think what they would use, but just some other antibiotic. And studies show that doesn't work as well. So it could be something like that. Now, on the herbal front, we have another situation like that where same thing, maybe whether it's an alternative practitioner, maybe they haven't been trained in SIBO. And so they're just going to use their favorite, I don't know, like all-in-one killing product that works for, yeast and parasites and viruses and bacteria. And the issue is with both antibiotics and herbal antibiotics, we have to target basically the type of SIBO, because we know there's different bacteria that are overgrown and they are killed by different things. And so over the years, we've been able to figure out which antibiotics and which herbals address each type of SIBO. And so maybe if somebody hasn't been trained in that, they just, great intentions, they just throw like an all-in-one killing herbal, and it might not be specific enough for the type of SIBO they have and in the right dose. We also have specific doses that are needed. So that happens a lot. Another thing that could happen, and this is what I see so often, or used to see all the time, is that they get going with a treatment that is good, it's correct, but they just give one round, like 1-2 week course for pharmaceuticals or elemental diet, which is the right amount, and then 4 or 6 weeks for herbs, and then that's it. But this is so common in the gastroenterology community. They just give someone rifaximin for 2 weeks and don't have any follow-up scheduled. They just assume it will take care of it. And so the key thing to know here is that being that this is an overgrowth, it's like there's a certain amount of bacteria that's overgrown, and for each person it's different. And we use the test actually to help us figure that out. So the test is very helpful. We chip away at it. It doesn't just go in the first round for a lot of people. For some people it will, and that's just beautiful and wonderful. But I would say for the majority, it's going to need more than one round, because it isn't a typical acute infection where you just, you give 2 weeks and it's done. So you give the 2 weeks, and then what it's done is it's brought it from here to here, but you're still positive. You still have overgrowth. So now you need another round to bring it to here, and you may even need 4 rounds. But so many practitioners don't know this. You need to have a little bit of training in SIBO to know this. And so they just give one round and think it's handled. And so, and the person may not even start feeling better until round 2, until the second round is completed. And so, or maybe they did feel better, but they're not finished. And then a final thing I'll say, and then I'll let you get a word in edgewise here, is there's also a second part of treatment is prevention of relapse. Because unfortunately, studies show about 2/3 of SIBO cases will relapse. It will be chronic in that it will come back. And why that is, for the main part, is because something is causing the SIBO. There are many causes of SIBO, and some of them are currently incurable. Medicine doesn't know how to get rid of them. And so until such time as that, a person will relapse. It doesn't mean they may not have nice big periods of remission. And it also, most people with our treatments get 80 to 90%, even 100% symptom relief. So it's like you can feel great. It just means it may come back. And so that's another thing that could happen is somebody might have been treated. Maybe they were the person that one round took care of it. but then there was no prevention given, and they start to relapse. And because that can happen quickly if there's no prevention given. And so they were better for a little while, and then they felt bad again. And then in their mind, that just equates to it didn't really work, And so these are the complicated things that could be.
Right. And, you mentioned they weren't given something to prevent it from coming back, but then I'm also just thinking about, just in my experience, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there's a motility component that gets disrupted just through the process of having SIBO. So you're not moving things through the small intestine the way you typically would. And so if that's not addressed, I see people all the time that maybe they got symptom relief from the antibiotics or whatever process they went through, but nobody addressed that motility component. And so, yes, it's part of prevention, but it's also just part of stabilizing the system before you move on and assume everything is resolved, is to make sure that motility is correct.
Yes. And the thing of it is that that's really, we're talking here about, in my perception, of underlying cause. That's sort of the main physiologic underlying cause. There are other ones, but that's the main one, is lack of migrating motor complex, motility in the small intestine. The problem with that is what is causing it to be deficient? And that's where we get into our huge list of underlying causes. And can those underlying causes be gotten rid of? So just for example, scleroderma, this is a more extreme example, but systemic sclerosis is currently incurable. I know scientists are working hard on it, and it's a progressive autoimmune disease. And part of that autoimmunity, the intestine is sclerosing or scarring, and then motility has a problem working physically because of the change in the tissue. And so how do we fix that? We would need to fix the scleroderma. We don't know how yet, so it can be difficult. Diabetes causes nerve damage, which, nerves can be repaired. At this time, I don't know of any actual cure for diabetes. Of course, it can be very well managed. And so we get into this kind of a problem, so of course we want to do anything we can to work on migrating motor complex, but we have to know what the underlying cause is, and then we have to know what's possible. It doesn't mean we shouldn't think outside of the box, and there's things to do, which I'm sure you've involved yourself in because you brought this up.
So just one other thing, it just came to my mind and thinking, I know there can be lots of different causes for SIBO, but the one that comes to my mind most often that tends to surprise people so much, and I wonder if you could speak to it, is food poisoning.
Yes.
Can you talk about that and that mechanism a little bit?
Absolutely. This is the number one most common cause of SIBO and IBS. Studies have shown it's the most common cause of IBS, and it's actually SIBO. So it kind of goes hand in hand. Yes, it's incredible. Dr. Pimentel figured out this whole sequence of causation and physiology. Basically, what happens is when someone gets food poisoning, which we could also call stomach flu or traveler's diarrhea, they may be different, but people can use these terms all similarly. There are certain pathogenic bacteria, they don't normally live in us, that we get exposed to, and they're pathogenic because they secrete toxins. But there's really one toxin they all secrete in common, depending, even if it's a different food poisoning bacteria. And so these are things like pathogenic E. coli and Campylobacter jejuni, salmonella, things like that. So this toxin is called cytolethal distending toxin. Portion B is what we're talking about here. So it's CDTB for short. And what this does is it unfortunately looks similar to one of the nerves in our small intestine, actually a protein on one of the nerves in the small intestine. And so through the process of mistaken identity, also called molecular mimicry or friendly fire, that's an autoimmune process where the body just confuses the toxin that looks so similar to this nerve that it starts to damage the nerve when it's trying to kill and get rid of the toxin. And so the body damages its own nerve cells. And these are the nerve cells that are called the ICC nerve cells that are responsible for the migrating motor complex, the movement in the small intestine, which, by the way, is a different movement than in the large intestine that creates bowel movements. This is the one that sort of clears away our food and debris after eating in the small intestine. And so when the nerves get damaged, they can't do the migrating motor complex motion, and it slows down. And just imagine like a stream or a river. When it's flowing well, it's clear and clean. But when it starts to really slow down and back up, it's like a swamp. And then bacteria can overgrow. And so that's the way it happens. The bacteria aren't being swept away. And so that's how food poisoning does it. It's an autoimmune mediated process, and it can be delayed. So you could have the food poisoning, you have the acute symptoms, which are awful, and then you may recover. And then anytime, even up to 6 months later, this autoimmune process can be going on. It might be a week later, it could be 2 months later. It's whenever the migrating motor complex slows down enough, and then you accumulate enough bacteria, you get SIBO. So a lot of people don't even associate it. They're like, well, that was 3 months ago. So it's very interesting and unfortunate. And this is the most prevalent cause. And we also currently don't have a cure for this autoimmunity. However, the good news is that Dr. Pimentel, who discovered all this, is hard at work trying to find a cure for just this exact problem. And I think it will come, soon. What does soon mean? Some years. He's hard at work on it. So there's hope for all the people that have this. And one last thing I want to mention is that there's a test for this exact cause, which is probably just what you were going to ask me. And it's a blood test. And I generally call it the IBS blood test, but it's testing for the antibodies that a person makes against that toxin, CDTB, and also against the nerve protein, which is called vinculin. And so that's how we know if somebody has it. So if that test is positive, we know that they have SIBO. We know that they have what's also called post-infectious IBS that develops after food poisoning. It could also be water poisoning, like contaminated water systems, because those are the same thing in this case. And we also know their underlying physiologic cause is deficient migrating motor complex. So very helpful. And this test can be used, really should be used in primary care offices as a screening test for IBS. But once you have this test, you still need the breath test, because we need to know which type of gas, like which type of SIBO you have and how high it is, because that determines our treatment.
Right. Okay. I'm sorry, Diana, because I'm like not letting you talk here. I don't mean to, but when you mentioned the breath testing earlier, and you said we're testing for the different types of SIBO, can you just explain just one more time, like what types of gases are being tested for, just so that we kind of clear that?
Yes. And I'm so glad you brought this back up, because so there's 3 gases: hydrogen, methane, and hydrogen sulfide. And those are the 3 types of SIBO, basically: hydrogen, methane, and hydrogen sulfide. Most of our breath tests that we've had all these years are really just checking for hydrogen and methane. It's very hard to check for hydrogen sulfide. Technically, there wasn't a test that was created for that until about 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. And there's only one test that I know of that does that currently, and that's been validated, and that is Trio Smart. So that one, it's called Trio because it checks for all 3 gases. And that is one of the tests where a patient can order their own lactulose SIBO Trio Smart breath test. So we're trying to see if any of those gases are present, and we want to know. And the thing is, there's different positive criteria for each gas. And I do have that listed on my website so people can go and look at that. But there's been, if you don't mind, I'll just mention, can I mention this right here, this interpretation? Okay. There's been different interpretations for many, many years now. Different labs use different interpretations, different studies, different countries, etc. I have always just used the interpretation that the main breath test manufacturer set out. But then I did before and after testing on everybody. I worked, created and worked in a SIBO specialty center. So I did have the luxury of being able to test all the time. People wanted that, as opposed to somebody going, no, I don't want it. And so that let me check out whether the interpretation criteria was panning out. Like, then if we treated them, did they get better, et cetera. So I use a certain criteria that's based on that. But in recent years, there has been an effort to standardize what's used in research, and that's called the North American Breath Test Consensus. What a lot of labs have done is adopted that criteria for, which is great for their lab tests, but unfortunately, clinically, it misses a lot of SIBO patients. So it's good for research because it's a little bit more stringent, and that's good for research. But as the practitioner with the person in front of you, or if you're the person, you just want to, if you really have it, you want to know if you really have it. And so unfortunately, I think the North American breath test consensus criteria can have false negatives. So I don't need to describe all the ins and outs of it. I do have it listed on my website. And I would say just go look at that. If you've had a breath test before and it said negative and you're like, well, then what is this? Maybe go back and look at those results and look at my website and compare the criteria. It might have been deemed a false negative. Even the TrioSmart they use North American breath test consensus. And I have had patients where the lab report says it's negative when it really isn't. So I just wanted people to be aware of that. And one other thing I'd like to mention, if you are going to do a TrioSmart test, that's a 2-hour test. And that's fine if you're only caring about hydrogen. But we want to use the test to look at methane and hydrogen sulfide as well. It's testing those gases also. You really need a 3-hour test for that because it's the 3rd hour that it represents the large intestine generally. So what I would do if you're going to do that test is set a timer and take your breath samples. There's usually about 9 or 10 samples, depending on what lab you're using. But on that one, set your timer for 22 minutes. And instead of 15, the lab recommends 15. But if you set it for 22, you'll stretch it to about 3 hours and you'll get a much better test. And you don't need to report that to the lab. They'll automatically adjust their report form to show what you did. So that's a strong recommendation.
Oh, that's so smart. Just extend the test.
Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. That's awesome. Is there anything else you want to talk to us about in terms of the basics of testing and treatment, that type of thing, before we go into more preventive strategies and that type of thing?
Yes, I'd like to mention, I said it a little bit, but that you really do need, except for elemental diet, you really do need your antibiotics or your herbal antibiotics to be based on the gas. And that's just so important for me to mention, because if you don't know that, you don't know that. And, if your practitioner doesn't know it, then you may not get an effective treatment. So I'll just give an example, for instance, for antibiotics. So for hydrogen type of SIBO, we just use rifaximin. But if somebody has methane, whether it's only methane or in addition to hydrogen, you then need to add either neomycin or metronidazole. That's what the studies show, and we know clinically will work to kill M. smithii. So that's very important, and a lot of people are just given rifaximin when they additionally have had methane. And actually, I'll just briefly say here that's one of the key things on interpretation. I know I said I wouldn't go into it, but I'll just mention it briefly, is that the general criteria for methane is 10 or above at any time in the whole 3 hours of the test. But what Dr. Pimentel has taught all of us from years and years ago is from 3 or above is positive if you have constipation. Constipation can go along with methane. So if a person has methane gas and they have constipation, anywhere from 3 to 9 is positive. So these are the little things you need to know. And then, the treatment. And then, for instance, for hydrogen sulfide, we would also use rifaximin, but now we add either bismuth, which isn't really a pharmaceutical, or high-dose oregano, which is an herbal. That's how we can get at the organisms that create the hydrogen sulfide. So as an example, I just wanted to mention that it's quite important to tailor the treatment to the gas or SIBO type that you have.
Okay. All right. So once someone has addressed the overgrowth itself, what are some of the key strategies to help prevent it from returning? Or maybe just in general, what are things that we can be doing to prevent it from happening in the first place?
Okay, so first, to prevent it from coming back, number one would be, do you know what the underlying cause is? It can be hard to figure out what the underlying cause is. There are so many. If you don't just know, you'd have to look at a list. And then I do have a list on my website. And then, work it through. What's your underlying cause? So the key thing we want to just always think about is, can we address or get rid of the underlying cause? Because that's how we can get rid of SIBO, right? But then what we always do is we give a prokinetic, and that's whether it's a pharmaceutical or natural, It's an agent that stimulates the migrating motor complex. And prokinetics often get confused with laxatives, but this is really an agent that is really just aimed at the small intestine migrating motor complex. Laxatives are really aimed at, sort of loosening stool and creating a bowel movement from the large intestine. So this is a different area of the body and that's being targeted. And it's important to mention it because they get confused really often and people will think that their laxative that they're already taking is a prokinetic, but laxatives don't stimulate the migrating motor complex. So it's really important to think about that. And also there are prescription laxatives like Linzess and Amitiza and things like that, that many, even including gastroenterologists, will think are prokinetics and can stimulate the migrating motor complex, but they don't. Mm-hmm. So what are these prokinetics? These are things, prescription-wise, it's things like prucalopride, which is known in the US as Motegrity, low-dose erythromycin. Erythromycin is an antibiotic, but in low dose, it works as a prokinetic, often used for delayed stomach emptying. And then low-dose naltrexone, LDN for short. It's not technically a prokinetic, but studies have shown it has prokinetic effects. And then on the natural front, we have ginger root. It's very well-known natural prokinetic. And then we have combination products that have been studied to show have really good prokinetic effects like Iberogast. And now there are like dupe formulas for that, like IBS Shield. So products like that. And then there's a new entry into this area with bitter orange. Bitter orange has very good animal studies as being a prokinetic. So all of these stimulate the migrating motor complex. That's what they do. And we take these at night before bed to stimulate it while we're sleeping because that's when we're fasting. And migrating motor complex works when we're fasting. So what we're trying to do there is just, once you've cleared the bacteria out, you've reduced it, it's gone. We're trying to maintain that by helping the migrating motor complex do the sweeping motion overnight and in between meals. Keep it clean, basically keep it clean, because we think most people have a migrating motor complex that isn't working that well. So that's why we're giving these things to just stimulate that. And then other things we can do would be using some kind of a reduced carbohydrate diet, or like basically a SIBO diet. But now it could be expanded to tolerance. Usually now you can eat a lot more foods because that overgrowth is gone. But, just maybe expand your SIBO diet, but still stay on some kind of a SIBO diet. And then there's other things like we can look at the other protections the body has against SIBO, which would be things like hydrochloric acid of the stomach. So many people have low stomach acid. If somebody does, let's give support for that, whether directly as hydrochloric acid pills or indirectly like apple cider vinegar or bitters can help stimulate that. Digestive enzymes also help prevent against SIBO. So how is somebody's enzyme secretion? Are they making enough enzymes? We could give enzymes supplementally. Things like that. Bile also works against SIBO. Is a person making enough bile? Many people don't. All of those sorts of things. And then so important is stress. And, we know stress can turn off the migrating motor complex. It turns off hydrochloric acid secretion and enzyme secretion. Basically, when someone is in fight or flight or sympathetic dominance, fight or flight we know is the opposite of rest and digest. So digest, that's where all those functions come when we're more in rest phase. And I think everybody faces stress and everything, but I think one of the ways it's so insidious in a chronic way is rushing, which is the, fight or flight. So, try not to rush and, anything we can do for stress reduction. There's so many things. There are also ways that we can help kind of specifically with gut-centered hypnotherapy. There are various apps that people use for things like that. Like there's one called the Nerva app, and a lot of people get good results with that. You can also go to a hypnotherapist. Another thing would be visceral manipulation. It's like massage for the internal organs, the abdomen really, and it can help with adhesions and various things. That can really help a lot. Also, I think really any kind of body work, really any kind, I have seen help with SIBO. So, whether it's chiropractic, acupuncture, various forms of massage and therapeutic body treatments all help. And, treatments that are focused on the vagus nerve, of course, also will help. That helps regulate motility. The vagus nerve is responsible for a lot of important aspects of digestion, and it is responsible for one phase of the migrating motor complex. And so all these things I mentioned about stress reduction do that already, but there are like vagal stimulators, sort of like little electronic devices that can stimulate. Those are helpful. So, so many things that we can do. There's more, but that's enough.
I just heard massage. I don't know. I heard you. I heard you recommend massage.
Yes.
Yeah, which is always like any excuse. So you had mentioned that there can be practitioners that might not understand exactly which antibiotic to prescribe for a particular type of SIBO, or maybe not pair it with the proper adjunct therapy, that sort of thing. So we know there can be mistakes made that way. Are there mistakes that patients make when trying to treat SIBO? Or anything common that comes to mind?
That's such a great question. I think it's not a mistake per se, but I would just say, and same with practitioners, giving up too early. If a person doesn't know that it takes more than one treatment round often, or that they need prevention treatments after the killing phase, I think so many patients, they get, one or two treatments for SIBO and it's not all resolved. And they think, well, I have a really tough case and, there's nothing that can be done, or it's too recalcitrant. And I've seen that so often. And this might be a person who is not going to be chronic and won't even relapse. They're just not finished getting rid of it. They just needed more treatment rounds. It's like if you had an acute infection and you were told to take your antibiotics for 7 days and you took them for 2 and stopped and then said, I have a case that's really hard and I'm never getting rid of it. It's like, but maybe they and their practitioner didn't know what was required, So I think, there aren't too many other, other than the obvious of not being compliant in taking their medicine, whatever, not going with the treatment as it's supposed to be done.
That's such a good one.
One thing that comes to my mind that I've encountered before is the thought that they can cure their SIBO with just diet. That just following the low FODMAP diet, because their symptoms seem to relieve, that they've fixed the problem, and then they're on this restricted diet long term. So
you are so right. Yeah, there are practitioners that have that thinking as well. They'll just prescribe like the low FODMAP diet and say, that's it, that we don't need to do anything else, and no follow-up, I mean, you said it beautifully. Once we reduce the bacteria, the diet can be expanded. These food intolerances clear, unless they were genetic, but if they were caused by the SIBO, yeah, we do not want people eating restricted forever. I mean, if a person, if they understand this, and if they, by their choice, are like, I don't want to do any other treatment, I just want to be on the diet, and they're fine, and their doctor's fine with the amount of restriction they have, okay, that's up to them. But as you said, many people don't know this. They actually think that's it. So we know that diet doesn't cure it, we'll say, because as soon as the person gets off the diet, the symptoms have returned. And, and that's usually what happens, is they just get really frustrated. They're on it long term and they just get frustrated. I can't go to any events. I can't eat at people out or eat other people's homes. And I don't want that anymore. So just now let's deal with it. So that's a really good point you made.
I was just going to kind of add on to your point real quick, is that I think I've seen many clients want to take that path of healing through diet, because they hear that the treatment may include an antibiotic and they are very opposed to it, being more naturally minded. So what would you say to that person who's like, oh dear, I never want to take an antibiotic?
You don't have to. You can use the herbs. Now, if they're not opposed to that, I mean, they are killing agents, but many people don't mind that, and you can do elemental diet, which, we didn't describe, but it's basically nutrition in its most broken down form in a powder, and you mix it with water and it's a drink. And the idea here is that it's kind of like a form of fasting, although you are getting all your nutrition, but it absorbs so quickly that the bacteria doesn't get a chance to feed from it. And so basically they starve, and it takes a while. So it's about a 14-day course. And in that time, people are typically not eating or solids or drinking other things other than this drink. So that's takes some mental fortitude, but many people do it. It's extremely effective. And one of the things that's so special about it is that it can reduce a really high amount of gas in that 2 weeks of time. I didn't talk about this explicitly, but the reason that we often need so many rounds of treatment with pharmaceutical or herbal antibiotics is because they can only reduce so much gas at a time, whereas elemental diet can reduce way more gas, like quadruple the amount that the other two methods can. So if someone was willing to take that challenge and do it, it could all be handled in 2 weeks. But so, yeah, just because there's antibiotics as one of the choices doesn't mean you don't have to use that one. There's 2 other options for you, So, and then what I would also say about the antibiotics is that if you have just hydrogen SIBO or even hydrogen sulfide SIBO, and you're going to be taking rifaximin or Xifaxan, that is not a standard typical antibiotic. So it's very important people understand that. It's considered to be an antibiotic with eubiotic effects. Some people don't even want to consider it an antibiotic because it doesn't have the negative side effects. So it doesn't disrupt the microbiome. In fact, it helps it. It increases lactobacillus and bifidus and a few other types of bacteria in the large intestine. Usually leaky gut is cleared after using it. Dr. Pimentel has done studies showing that the entire small intestine microbiome returns to normal after the use of rifaximin. It's been shown not to cause yeast overgrowth. That's another concern with antibiotics. It doesn't have many side effects, like many antibiotics can cause nausea or things like that. Rifaximin actually tests equal to or lower than placebo, which is like a nothing, taking nothing, they compare it to. It has many other benefits. Like just another one is that it's anti-inflammatory. It works on the NF-kappa B pathway of inflammation. It's anti-inflammatory. So people do not need to be afraid of taking that one. It does not cause microbiome disruption or yeast overgrowth in studies. Anything's possible for any person. But so now the other antibiotics that we use, like with methane, would be neomycin or metronidazole. They are typical antibiotics. So I don't have a wonderful story about those, but if you have the hydrogen type or if you have the hydrogen sulfide type, then you're using bismuth. That's not an antibiotic, or oregano. So you would not be facing the same challenges as what people think of when they think of antibiotics. And one other thing, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention is that it doesn't absorb into the body. It stays just in the intestines. And actually, it stays just in the small intestine.
Incredible. That's a really good clarification, though. So I'm curious, like, for someone that didn't want to use the more systemic antibiotics, if they have the methane, could you combine the herbal antimicrobials with the rifaximin so that you could kind of get the best of both worlds?
Absolutely. The only oddity about it is that for pharmaceutical antibiotics, it's 2 weeks, but for herbs, to get the same effect, we need to do it for 4 weeks. And sometimes we stretch a little longer with each if a person has high gas, but we usually don't go past 3 weeks for antibiotics or 6 weeks for herbs. But so there'll be a week, maybe at the beginning or end, or 2 weeks where you'll be just doing the antibiotics for methane without the pharmaceutical. And nobody has really figured out, is there one way that's best of how to combine them? So it really doesn't matter, however, but absolutely you could do that.
Excellent. So everybody stick around because we have one more quick question. We're trying to squeeze every second out of having you here. So stick around for one last quick question you won't want to miss. But first, Dr. Siebecker, what resources do you have that you would love to share with our audience? I know you talked about your website, which is so good. So what else should we know, like where to find you and all of that?
Yeah, that's the best place. And I also have continuing education courses for practitioners if they want to learn more in specifics. I've got a mini course, I've got long courses. And then for patients, I do monthly Q&As, so they could come to those if they want. And I also consult for, if people want, to hear some advice from me, I do small group coaching. where I consult with people in a small group about their situation. And then also I have a YouTube channel, and I'm always posting educational videos there and interviews, like what's the newest research from Dr. Pimentel and things like that. So, and you can see all of that on my website, which is SIBO info.
Yeah, you're a gem. So everybody, you need to go do a deep dive and get to know Dr. Siebecker. You probably already do, but for the one person who maybe doesn't that's listening. Okay, so last question. If there was one takeaway that you would want to give to the listener today, maybe someone that's suspecting they might have SIBO, what would that be? We talked about so much. So I know I'm asking you to distill that down into a takeaway, but what would you say?
I think I would say, I know I already said it, but I think I would say, don't give up. Like, don't quit too early, and don't think you're a lost cause, and if you're a practitioner and you think none of the SIBO treatments work, they do. You just maybe check out my website and learn some of the more refined treatments. And, I even have master classes on tough cases and how to handle them and things like that. But, people can be fatigued from this whole thing. It's very tiring. But if you can put your energy to sticking with it, 90% symptom relief is the norm. It's the norm. And even if that means, a combination of repeating treatments and then diet, but diets with the combination of the treatments and then the diets. And if you really experiment around with your diet, you don't have to follow each diet as it's written. Almost always there's things you can tolerate that the diet says you can't. You experiment around and put that time in, you can have good quality of life where you have a diet that isn't too restricted and you're not suffering, so that's the key thing is there's absolutely hope. Don't give up. And you can be close to symptom free.
Oh, this is great. I think you've connected so many dots for our listeners today. We're so grateful for that. And you're such a wealth of information and so generous with what you provide free to people out there that are just dying for the help, just needing the help to feel good. So thank you for all you contribute.
Oh, thank you so much. That's so kind. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again for sharing your expertise and your time. You're just a wizard and delightful and all of the things. So thank you so much. And thank you to our audience. We really appreciate you spending your time with us. And do make sure to check out the additional episodes we're going to have on this gut health series. So look for those. But thank you all, and we'll see you next time.
This episode was brought to you by Practice Better. Learn more at practicebetter.io. Don't miss a beat. Find other episodes and subscribe to this podcast on YouTube or check us out on your favorite streaming app. Now available on Apple Podcasts, Pandora, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and more. You can also visit nanp.org for more information. Looking for a board-certified holistic nutrition professional to support you on your health journey? Go to nanp.org to get started today. Membership in the NANP provides you with a competitive advantage. Whether you're a current practitioner or a student, we want you to become an active, informed leader of the holistic nutrition community and join our association today. When you're ready to go a step further, you can boost your credibility by becoming board certified in holistic nutrition. Visit nanp.org today to apply. The information on the NANP podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical or legal advice. The NANP is not liable or responsible for any harm, damage, or illness arising from the use of the information contained herein. By listening to the information on this podcast, you agree to defend, indemnify, and hold harmless the NANP and all agents. Copyright NANP, all rights reserved. Until next time, stay nourished.